Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into one of Africa's most enduring and, let's face it, complex geopolitical rivalries.
That's right.
We're talking about the often antagonistic foreign policy of Ethiopia toward its neighbor, Somalia.
hmm
We're drawing from a whole wealth of historical documents, rigorous research, and recent geopolitical analyses that you've shared with us.
Yeah, a lot to get through.
Our mission today is to truly unpack the motivations, the precise strategies, and the profound, sometimes devastating implications of Ethiopia's approach.
And how deep it all goes.
Exactly, revealing how deeply historical grievances and strategic fears have shaped decades of regional dynamics.
It's striking, isn't it? How the roots of this relationship stretch back far beyond recent headlines.
Yeah.
This isn't just a contemporary rivalry. It's a story that truly spans centuries, shaping everything that has followed.
So, okay, if we go right back to the beginning, how did this adversarial relationship first take shape between Ethiopia and Somalia? Where do we find its origins?
It really traces back to the late 19th century, during the colonial scramble for Africa.
Right.
Emperor Menelik II, he shrewdly expanded into Somali-inhabited lands, specifically the Ogaden and Hard regions.
Okay.
But here's the crucial detail. Britain, in a treaty signed in 1897, simply ceded these territories to Abyssinia.
Ethiopia's historical name, yeah.
Exactly, ceded them. And this happened without any Somali consent or participation whatsoever.
Wow, none.
None. So for Somalis, this wasn't legitimate governance by a local power. It was, as one source vividly puts it, African colonial subjugation by Ethiopia.
Like trading one colonial master for another.
Precisely. They felt they were being handed over. That immediately sets a foundation of deep resentment.
Absolutely. So fast forwarding then to the mid-20th century, what happened when British influence started to wane in the 1940s and Emperor Haile Selassie entered the picture?
Well, Haile Selassie didn't back down. In fact, he openly laid claim to even broader Somali regions.
Really? Even more?
Oh, yes. He went so far as to assert that the Mogadishu coast rightfully belonged to Ethiopia, unequivocally denying any notion of Somali self-determination.
So just flat-out denial.
Flat out. This insistence absolutely set the stage for decades of conflict. So when Somalia finally gained independence in 1960,
A huge moment.
the rise of pan-Somali nationalism, that powerful movement aiming to unite all Somali territories into a greater Somalia, was perceived in Addis Ababa as nothing less than an existential threat.
An existential threat to Ethiopia's own territory.
Exactly, to its integrity.
And this wasn't just, diplomatic talk, was it? With that level of perceived threat, what were the immediate consequences? Did it lead to direct confrontation?
Absolutely. Tensions exploded into the 1964 Ethiopian-Somali War.
Okay.
Somalia directly backed insurgents in Ethiopia's Ogaden region.
Which Ethiopia controlled but was Somali inhabited.
Correct. And Ethiopia responded with brutal counterinsurgency tactics, airstrikes.
That works. And other neighbors got involved too.
Well, to contain what both Ethiopia and Kenya saw as the continuing threat of Somali irredentism.
That desire to reclaim lost territories.
Yes. Emperor Haile Selassie forged a strategic alliance with Kenya in 1964. They signed a mutual defense pact.
A united front against Somalia, basically.
Pretty much. And the Cold War must have just poured fuel on this fire.
Right. How did that global conflict play out here between these two?
It certainly did. The decisive moment was the 1977-78 Ogaden War.
The big one.
Yeah, Ethiopia with massive Soviet and Cuban support.
Switching sides in the Cold War alignment.
Exactly. They definitively defeated Somalia's attempt to liberate the Ogaden. This left Somalia humiliated, internally destabilized.
And that fed into its later collapse.
Correctly. It fed right into its later civil implosion. So if you peel back the layers, the single unwavering objective Ethiopia has pursued regarding Somalia
From Menelik through Haile Selassie and after.
is startlingly consistent.
Yeah.
To prevent a strong, unified Somalia and preserve its own territorial integrity, even if it meant perpetual hostility.
A kind of preemptive strategic defense?
You could call it that, yeah.
That sounds less like a fluctuating foreign policy and more like a deep ingrained national fear.
It does feel that way.
So what happens then when Somalia itself falls apart? When Siad Barre's regime collapsed in 1991, Somalia descends into civil war, state collapse. How did Ethiopia react to this seismic event?
Well, the sources say Ethiopia eagerly moved to exploit and perpetuate that fragmentation.
Eagerly, so not just passively watching.
Not at all. And what's crucial to understand is that this wasn't actually a new strategy for them.
Oh.
Even before Barre's fall, Ethiopia's Marxist Derg regime, the one that overthrew Haile Selassie.
Right, from 74 to 91.
They were already backing various clan-based rebel movements against Barre, sort of laying the groundwork for further disunity.
So this divide-and-rule strategy was already in motion before Somalia's complete collapse. How did Ethiopia then specifically fan the flames of internal conflict to ensure this fragmentation?
Throughout the 1980s, Addis Ababa armed and sheltered virtually every major Somali insurgent faction, and largely along clan lines.
Okay. Can you give examples?
Sure. For instance, in 1982, Ethiopia launched a large-scale incursion into central Somalia alongside the Somali Salvation Democratic Front, the SSDF.
Which clan group was that?
That was a Majority Droid clan militia. But at the same time, they were supplying and training the Somali National Movement, the SNM.
That's the Isaac clan group, right? Fighting for what's now Somaliland.
Exactly. And by the late 1980s, Ethiopia was also covertly arming the United Somali Congress, the USC.
Hawaii clan in the south.
That's the one. So this wasn't just opportunistic chaos. A Human Rights Watch analysis called it a deliberate divide-and-rule strategy.
Deliberate.
The aim was to ensure that any eventual Somali victory over Barre would result in multiple rival power centers, rather than a cohesive new state.
And the immediate outcomes of 1991 certainly reflected that, didn't they? Somalia splintered, SNM declaring Somaliland independent, USC warlords carving up the south. How did Ethiopia react to this intense fragmentation playing out?
Ethiopia welcomed this outcome. They cultivated friendly relations with Somaliland secessionists, trade links, security cooperation.
But they never formally recognized Somaliland.
Crucially, no, never formally recognized its independence. And this stance kept the Somali territories in legal limbo, perpetually divided.
Clever. Allows Addis Ababa to benefit without setting a precedent.
Precisely. And in the northeast, Ethiopia supported SSDF leader Abdullahi Yusuf in establishing the autonomous Puntland region in 1998.
Another regional bloc.
Again, encouraging a regional polity, not answering to Mogadishu.
So it wasn't just about fostering these new entities, but also direct military interventions in Somalia's internal wars throughout the 90s.
That's right. These interventions were often framed as countering Islamist militants.
Like al-Ittihad.
Exactly. But they invariably sided with one faction against another, basically to keep the country fragmented.
For example?
Well, Ethiopian troops struck al-Ittihad bases in Gedo and Puntland in the mid-90s. And in 1996, they helped a Rahanwein militia faction expel rival warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid's forces from Baidoa.
Aidid, the famous Mogadishu warlord.
The very same. So by helping push him out, they were essentially entrenching these clan-based fiefdoms across the south.
And so the net effect?
The net effect of Ethiopia's involvement during this period was basically to prevent any single Somali faction from winning nationally, locking Somalia into what one source called a patchwork of warring clan mini-states.
A grim picture. Okay, moving into the 2000s, it seems Ethiopia's strategy evolved slightly. This next phase, it seems really crucial. How did Ethiopia begin to exert influence more directly, but maybe from behind the scenes, like a puppeteer?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They shifted to a strategy of clientelism.
Clientelism, explain that.
It's essentially using direct sponsorship of warlords and politicians to dominate Somalia's political landscape from behind the scenes.
So finding proxies.
Finding proxies, funding them, arming them, multiple investigative accounts, leaked intelligence. They've exposed how Ethiopia became the patron of numerous Somali warlords after the state collapsed, turning them into clients.
And this actively undermined any early efforts to rebuild a central Somali government, didn't it? Because you have these proxies running around.
Precisely. During the early 2000s, as Somalia tried to rebuild, Ethiopia actively bankrolled and armed an array of faction leaders.
Well, who?
Well, there was the Somalia Reconciliation and Restoration Council, the SRRC. This was a coalition of warlords formed explicitly to oppose the internationally recognized Transitional National Government, the TNG, from 2000.
So actively undermining the recognized government.
Actively. They allied with notorious Mogadishu warlords like Muse Sudi Yalahau, General Morgan's Somali Patriotic Movement, the Rahanwein Resistance Army.
Big names from the warlord era.
Yeah. And Ethiopia supplied these groups with weapons violating UN arms embargoes and even hosted warlord meetings on its own soil.
Wow. How did the TNG react to this? What must have felt like just blatant interference?
Well, the TNG president at the time, Abdiqasem Salad Hassan, he bitterly accused Ethiopia of destabilizing Somalia by interfering daily in Somali affairs.
And Ethiopia's response?
Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi made no apologies. He justified his country's incursions by claiming Somali Islamists, specifically Al-Ittihad, had infiltrated the TNG.
Ah, the terrorist label.
Exactly, effectively labeling any unfriendly Somali elements as terrorists to justify intervention.
And Ethiopia wasn't shy about outright military interventions to install its proxies either, was it? Can you give some specific examples of this direct action?
Not at all shy. In 2001-2002, there was a leadership dispute in Puntland. It pitted Ethiopia's longtime client, Abdullahi Yusuf, against a rival.
Yusuf again.
Yusuf again. Ethiopian troops crossed the border to forcibly seat Yusuf in power. Hundreds of Ethiopian soldiers helped oust his opponent.
Direct intervention.
Direct military intervention. Around the same time, Ethiopian forces staged an incursion into Somalia's ghetto region. They seized the town of Beled Howell from a local Islamic militia, captured the town, and promptly handed control over to the SRRC warlord alliance that Ethiopia supported.
Just handed it over.
Handed it over.
And by 2004, this strategy seemed to culminate in a major victory for Ethiopia, didn't it? Getting their man in charge.
It did look that way. By 2004, Ethiopia had successfully maneuvered its main client, Abdullah Yusuf, into the presidency of a new transitional federal government, the TFG.
The TFG, okay.
And it was an open secret that Yusuf's TFG was Ethiopian-backed, heavily dependent on Ethiopian military protection.
And there were conditions.
Oh, yes. One of Addis Ababa's key conditions was that Yusuf renounced Somalia's historic territorial claim to Ethiopia's Ogaden region.
A huge concession for any Somali leader.
Massive. So, in effect, Ethiopia midwifed a Somali federal government designed to pose no threat to Ethiopian interests. A significant strategic win for them.
So it's really no surprise then that when an independent Islamist administration, the Islamic Courts Union, the ICU, briefly took control of Mogadishu in 2006, Ethiopia viewed this as a direct and dangerous challenge.
Absolutely. A direct challenge to their client and their strategy. Ethiopia invaded Somalia with massive force.
Why? What was the fear?
They feared a resurgent Somali nationalism. Meles Zenawi explicitly argued that a strong, unified Somali state, especially one led by Islamists, not beholden to Addis Ababa, would constitute a dangerous revival of the greater Somalia ideology.
That old fear again.
That old fear. And there was a leaked U.S.-Ethiopian strategy meeting in 2006. It revealed that both governments' worst-case scenario was the ICU actually stabilizing Somalia.
Stabilizing Somalia was the worst case.
For them, yes. Which led Washington to give tacit backing to Ethiopia's intervention to prevent that.
So Ethiopia ousted the ICU.
Ousted the ICU, occupied Somalia for 2 years, 2007 and 2008, basically to reinstall the compliant TFG, their client government.
And this pattern of cultivating client relationships with Somali power brokers, it just continued, right? Into the late 2000s, 2010s.
Absolutely. Ethiopian military intelligence maintained an unofficial but very real presence.
How pervasive was this influence? What did it mean for Somali politics on the ground?
Well, Ethiopian officers basically became kingmakers in Somali regional politics. There was a really dramatic instance in Southwest State in 2018.
What happened there?
Ethiopian troops allegedly arrested a popular presidential candidate, a former al-Shabaab commander, Mukhtar Robo, who had renounced violence.
Arrested a candidate.
To clear the way for Ethiopia's preferred ally to become state president. That's the allegation.
Wow.
And similar patterns played out in Jubaland. Ethiopia would alternate between backing the regional president, Ahmed Madobe, and then supporting his rivals, depending on whatever suited Addis Ababa's interests at that moment.
A constant balancing act to maintain influence.
Exactly. The net result is that no Somali leader can entirely ignore Ethiopia. Addis Ababa either becomes their sponsor, or it actively works to undermine them using rivals. It preserves tremendous leverage over Somalia's path.
So moving beyond direct interventions and these client networks, Ethiopia seems to have pursued an even more structural strategy. To prevent the reemergence of a strong Somali nation, how did they attempt to influence Somalia's very governance structure?
Well, back when Somalia's 15th attempt at forming a central government was brokered in 2004, Ethiopia was a chief architect of the outcome.
How so?
Addis Ababa championed what they called a building blocks approach.
Yeah.
This idea had been floated by Ethiopian diplomats back in the late 1990s.
Building blocks, what does that mean?
It insisted that Somalia be reconstituted from its autonomous regions upward, so power flowing up from the regions, rather than down from a strong unitary central authority in Mogadishu.
And what did this building blocks approach mean in practice for Somalia? How did it shape the country?
It meant carving Somalia into constituent federal member states. These states would share sovereignty with Mogadishu.
So federalism.
Federalism. Now, Ethiopian officials and their regional allies argued this was necessary to prevent a return to a Mogadishu-dominated dictatorship like under Barre.
But how did Somalis see it?
Many Somalis saw it as an external imposition, something forced upon them, designed by outsiders, particularly Ethiopia.
It's interesting, though. Ethiopia itself is an ethnically federal state. Why would they promote such a system in Somalia? What was the strategic thinking?
Well, analysts note that Ethiopia promoted clan-based federalism in Somalia, specifically as a means to keep the country weak and decentralized.
Ah, the clan dimension is key.
It is. Both Ethiopia and neighboring Kenya had strategic reasons to fear a revived unitary Somali republic, one that could again press those irredentist claims.
For the Ogaden, for the Somali parts of Kenya.
Exactly. So by supporting a federal formula, especially one based on clans, they ensured Somalia's central government would be permanently tied up with squabbling states, unable to project a united national policy.
And this approach was written into Somalia's constitution.
Yes, Somalia's 2012 provisional constitution clearly reflected this diluted sovereignty. It created powerful federal member states, Puntland, Jubaland, Southwest, Galmudug, Hirshabelle.
With Somaliland staying out, rejecting the federation?
Right. And the constitution left many key powers ambiguous. Unclear who holds them, the center or the states.
Leading to constant disputes.
Constant disputes. Somalia's federal model has sometimes been described as one of dual sovereignty. State presidents often act like heads of quasi-countries.
Making their own deal.
Making their own deals with foreign powers, controlling their own regional security forces, defying the central government, often with few consequences.
And Ethiopia has skillfully leveraged this system. How have they done that?
Oh, absolutely. Ethiopia engages directly with individual Somali states, frequently bypassing Mogadishu entirely.
Examples.
Signing separate security and economic pacts with, say, Puntlands or Jubaland, stationing troops or investing in ports under bilateral agreements just with those states. All of this undermines the federal government's claim to exclusive sovereignty.
This raises a really important question then about the most recent striking case. The secret deal Ethiopia reportedly reached with Somaliland in 2024, this seems like a culmination of this strategy.
It really does. That reported deal offered Somaliland something huge. Recognition of its independence.
In exchange for?
In exchange for a leased seaport and naval base access for Ethiopia.
A sea outlet for landlocked Ethiopia.
Exactly. Now, if that deal is finalized, it would blatantly endorse Somalia's breakup. But even if it's not finalized, the message is crystal clear.
Which is?
Ethiopia prefers a Somalia that is a loose collection of regions, easy to influence, unlikely to unite on any policy contrary to Ethiopian interests.
And Somali critics see this as?
They argue the whole principle of federal power sharing has been warped into permanent paralysis, ensuring Somalia can't form a cohesive national army or foreign policy, which is precisely what Ethiopia's security doctrine has long sought.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit then. How do all these tactics, historical claims backing militias, clientelism, engineering federalism, how do they fit together? Is there a single playbook underpinning Ethiopia's Somalia policy?
It seems there is. The sources suggest Ethiopia's policy is underpinned by a classic divide-and-rule playbook, applied with what's described as Machiavellian patience.
Machiavellian patience, so long-term.
Very long-term. It's not haphazard. It's a calculated manipulation that exploits Somalia's internal clan fissures and rivalries at every single turn.
And how does Ethiopia apply this cynical balancing act, shifting patronage among different groups? It sounds incredibly intricate to manage.
It is intricate. Rather than favoring one group consistently, Ethiopia shifts patronage among clans and faction leaders. The goal is to keep them off balance and competing for Addis Ababa's favor.
So not picking one winner.
No. During the 90s and 2000s, Ethiopia at various times armed factions from practically every major Somali clan family.
Every major family.
Hawaii warlords one year, Dawood militias the next, then Rahanwein groups, Ogaden groups. It's described as a rotating carousel of alliances.
And the key insight here is
the key seems to be that Ethiopia gave each faction just enough support to vex their rivals, but never enough to create a new, uncontested authority. Keep everyone needing Ethiopia.
So what happened if any ally grew too strong or became, uncooperative? Would Ethiopia just abandon them?
Worse, Ethiopia would actively cut them down to size by empowering their adversaries.
Play them off against each other.
Exactly. For instance, when relations soured with that Islamist-leaning TNG government in 2001, Addis switched support to the secular SRC warlords it had previously opposed in some ways.
Okay.
Later, when one of those warlords, Abdullah Yusuf, became Somalia's president, Ethiopia then kept him dependent by bankrolling friendly regional presidents who could check his power.
Always maintaining leverage.
Always. Ethiopia has even, according to sources, quietly encouraged Somali-on-Somali clan conflict. For example, by favoring one clan's bid for a regional presidency and maybe deploying troops to ensure that clan's victory. This has been seen in power struggles in the Southwest and Jubaland states.
So by playing clans against each other,
Ethiopia ensures itself against a united Somali front.
what's particularly revealing here, you mentioned it earlier, is the deep historical fear that seems to drive this whole approach. Can you elaborate on that again?
It really seems central. An Africa analyst observed that Ethiopian officials essentially view Somalis through the lens of the Ahmed Grand syndrome.
Ahmed Gran, the 16th century imam.
Yes, who led a Somali conquest of large parts of Ethiopia.
Yeah.
It's this deep historical fear of Somali unity. So they believe Ethiopia's security fundamentally depends on keeping Somalia permanently divided against itself.
Wow. That historical memory is powerful.
And it seems to fundamentally inform their strategy, yes.
And these divide and rule tactics, they extend beyond just political maneuvers, right?
Yeah.
They include economic and military rewards, too?
Exactly. Addis Ababa might offer development aid or military training to a cooperative regional administration.
Yeah.
Say, troops for Puntland security or investment in border trade controlled from Jigjiga, the capital of Ethiopia's Somali region.
While withholding from others.
While withholding or even sabotaging assistance to a Somali federal government that isn't compliant. It also courts local clan elders and militias in border areas directly, with arms and cash, building these patronage networks that bypass formal institutions entirely.
And recent events really underscore this, specifically that 2024 accusation from Somalia's government about weapons.
Yes, that was significant. Somalia's government accused Ethiopia of smuggling truckloads of weapons to Puntland.
Puntland, which had just declared a sort of autonomy dispute with Mogadishu.
Exactly. And allegedly without any approval from the Somali federal government. If that's confirmed, it strongly suggests Ethiopia was actively bolstering a breakaway-minded Somali statelet specifically to weaken Somalia's unity.
And Somalia protested.
Strongly.
Yeah.
Somalia's foreign ministry called it a grave infringement on Somalia's sovereignty.
Yet Ethiopia still doesn't officially recognize Puntland or Somaliland as independent.
Correct. It wants them in limbo. That's the phrase used. Neither fully sovereign nor under a strong Somali union. This maintains maximum Ethiopian influence.
So instability itself becomes a tool.
It appears so. A fragmented Somalia is one where Addis Ababa can be the ultimate power broker, stepping in as mediator or peacekeeper whenever it suits its interests, while ensuring no Somali faction ever grows strong enough to challenge Ethiopia's regional dominance.
Okay, so what does this all mean? For Somalia, for the wider region, what have been the long-term consequences of this sustained policy of, well, sabotaging Somali cohesion?
Somalia remains, in the words of one observer, a fragile jigsaw of federal states whose instability weakens the central government.
The jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, the inability of Somalia to reconstitute a robust nation-state, one capable of providing security and services to its people. It can be directly traced, at least in part, to these external pressures and the internal divisions stoked by Ethiopia.
And what has filled that perpetual power vacuum in Somalia over the years?
Warlordism, for one, extremist insurgency, and constant foreign meddling.
Like al-Shabaab.
Al-Shabaab is a key example. That Ethiopian invasion of 2006-2008, yes, it ousted the Islamic courts, but it also inflamed Somali nationalism in a really destructive way.
How so?
It inadvertently helped transform al-Shabaab from what was a relatively fringe militia into a powerful insurgency. They claimed nationalist legitimacy as the resistance to foreign occupation.
So the intervention backfired, in a way.
You could argue it created a bigger, longer-term problem. Al-Shabaab's rise, the ensuing terrorism, its prolonged regional instability and humanitarian crises for years. So Ethiopia's pursuit of short-term supremacy, you could say, sowed the seeds of long-term chaos that still plague the Horn of Africa.
This has even led to what some commentators grimly call the Never Somalia doctrine, right?
That's right. That's a stark term.
Yeah.
Since 1991, the argument goes, no Somalia as a cohesive entity has been allowed to fully emerge.
Generations growing up without a functioning state.
Exactly. Generations of Somalis have grown up without a functioning central government capable of providing basic security or defining a national direction. And every time some semblance of order or unity starts to appear,
Ethiopia steps in.
it seems to encounter Ethiopian-engineered setbacks. Whether it's sponsored no-confidence motions in parliament, or military incursions, or arming spoilers. This has led some Somali commentators to characterize Ethiopia's policy as never Somalia.
An unofficial doctrine.
An unofficial doctrine that Somalia should never again be allowed to become a strong, unified state. And what's striking is the consistency across different Ethiopian regimes.
Imperial, socialist, the current federal government.
All have consistently acted, according to this analysis, to keep Somalia fragmented and weak, despite their own huge ideological differences.
And how has this deep-seated, consistent policy impacted broader regional stability across the Horn of Africa?
Well, a weak Somalia invites other neighbors, Kenya, for instance, to also play divide and influence games within Somalia.
Creates a free-for-all.
It does. It also creates a vacuum where global powers vie for proxy influence. Seems to. The Horn of Africa remains one of the most volatile regions in the world, partly because of this unresolved Somali question.
But this dominance, this constant intervention, it must come at a cost for Ethiopia itself, doesn't it? It can't be all benefit.
No, it absolutely comes at a cost. Ethiopia's dominance over Somalia has cemented its role as the preeminent power in the Horn, sure, but at the cost of perpetual conflict at its doorstep.
Right.
Ethiopia achieved its goal, preventing an irredentist Greater Somalia. But now it contends with a different, perhaps equally dangerous threat, a chronic, failed state scenario next door.
Which spills over.
Exactly. It spews militancy, refugees, weapons, instability across its borders. Even Ethiopian military officials apparently acknowledge that Somalia's weakness is a double-edged sword, meaning it requires Ethiopia to constantly intervene just to contain the fallout, effectively trapping Addis Ababa in the role of being the gendarme over a broken land. It's a constant drain.
And so in sum, the source material makes a really powerful case, I think. Ethiopia's foreign policy towards Somalia, historically driven by this potent mix of fear and realpolitik.
Yep.
From Emperor Menelik II stopping Somali nationalism in its tracks to systematically fomenting clan fragmentation, backing client regimes, cynically manipulating Somalia's federal structure.
All roads lead to one goal.
All these tactics consistently aim to ensure Somalia remain too divided, too weak, to ever threaten Ethiopia's territorial integrity or its regional dominance.
And the stark paradox here, the real tragedy, is that while this approach has succeeded in preventing a strong, unified Somali state,
it
has also condemned the Somali people to generations of turmoil and prevented the entire Horn of Africa from enjoying the immense benefits that stable statehood could bring.
That's the crux of it. The Never Somalia strategy, this consistent refusal, it seems, to allow Somalia to fully revive as a cohesive nation, it achieved Ethiopia's immediate security objectives. No doubt.
The cost. But it simultaneously perpetuates a cycle of instability that fundamentally undermines any hope of long-term peace for the entire region.
Yeah.
It's described as a grim paradigm of tower politics.
Yeah.
Ethiopia's relationship with Somalia framed as one of calculated sabotage and hegemonic control, treating an entire neighboring nation less as a sovereign equal and more as a client to be weakened, an arena to be manipulated.
So thinking about all this, what does it all mean for you, listening? How might this deep dive reshape your understanding of geopolitical strategy? Or maybe the often unintended, very long-lasting consequences of security policies?
Yeah, it raises huge questions, and the ultimate one remains. Will this destructive dynamic ever give way to something more constructive, a more cooperative regional order? Or will Ethiopia continue to prefer a Somalia that is, in effect, absent as a nation, present only as a geography?